Hello guys, how are we doing? Welcome to Geoff's indoor garden. I know we're not exactly indoors at the moment, but I thought I'd just give myself a quick introduction and show off some of my selection of houseplants that I've collected over the last couple of years. My inspiration for this came when I work in a garden centre. And a lot of people send all the questions over to me because I've been so obsessed with houseplants. I just begun to know everything there. And I find a lot of people are making the same mistakes over again. So that's what inspired me to do this video. So those of you that are watching, those of you that are a bit unsure of what you're doing with your plants, or maybe you might just find something a bit interesting here, I want to reassure you that we can make this as easy for you as possible. Just takes a few little tips and tricks. We'll show you how we can get things will be cheaper than what many people would advise you to do, and go from there. So I'm going to be going through the next hour a few different things, like what sort of plants to choose, where to put them in your house that's going to be best for those plants and easiest for you to look after them. We're going to look at how to look after them, things like what sort of soils to be putting them in, how much drainage they need, what sort of water they need, if they need feeding, and a lot of little tips and tricks along the way, as well as the care routines for a lot of foliage, cacti, bromelias. We'll have a quick look at things like orchids, and we'll do our best to make sure that you all have a flourishing house. We're going to start off quite easy when it comes to the what. What plants do we want in our house? As many of you may know, cacti and succulents are some of the easiest plants to take care of. They need little attention. The main thing is good drainage. We'll go through all of that later on. So I've got a selection of cacti that I've planted into one pot here. That just gives you an idea that pretty much most cacti and a lot of succulents you can treat very much the same way, apart from a few exceptions. We'll get to that. So we've got pretty common cacti that you'll find in most garden centres. These little ones here I actually grew from cuttings. They just, a friend of mine's, he moved his plant. These little fellas fell off, so I've just popped them in the soil, and we'll go through all of that when it comes to the care, but they take root really easily. So as well as the cacti, I just thought I'd show you another one here. This one is a project of another friend of mine who donated this to me. They were showing an example of how you can cut the top of a cacti, take a cutting from that, and a new one will grow from there. But what I wanted to show you is recycling in an old tin. Again, when it comes to the care, we're going to go through what you need to do to a tin just to help the plant. So we'll get to all of that later. I've even got a few examples of things that some people might do that I would always advise is best to avoid, but I can show you what to do if that's done. So here I've got a succulent that is in a planter that has no drainage. So these little terrariums can be quite popular for people. Some people like to just put them in plain sand or grit. I've chosen to just put cactus compost inside this one. As I say, there is nowhere for the water to go. So we're going to go through what to do when you've done that, and if it will survive. Subject of cacti and succulents. Succulents, one very common and popular one is our lovely friends Sensio raulianus and Carapegia. So they're known as string of hearts, string of pearls. So one is succulent and one is semi-succulent, but we will treat it the same as you will most succulents. That's another thing I'll go through, is when to know when to treat something the same as a succulent when it doesn't quite look like one, because that can get a little bit confusing. But these ones are very popular. Everybody loves trailing plants. They're really easy, as long, again, as they've got the right conditions in the first place. This one is Tradescantia pallida. Now this is a rare one to find, and it is one of my all-time favourite plants. Unfortunately, there are no flowers at the moment, but it does flower very easily. You'll get this beautiful little pink flower just inside that little space there. It's difficult to come across this. I've never seen it for sale. Again, this is one I took a cutting from a friend. I originally took probably about that much, and look at it now. This is why it's my all-time favourite. I now have 2 pots about this size, and I've given some to friends. It grows really easily, grows from cuttings. It's great fun, and it's kind of squeaky as well. The next easiest thing to take care of are a lot of the exotic foliage plants. So there's quite a few different varieties that we can go for. I'll start off with the ficus, or fig, ornamental fig. We've got things such as the Ficus benjamina. You may recognise this in the corners of some offices and such. It's easy to take care of foliage plant that will eventually turn into a sort of tree-like structure depending on the pot size that you give it. Now mind out, there's a few of these plants that aren't looking at their best, but I've done that for a good reason, you'll find out later. Alright, so the next ficus that we have is Ficus elastica. This is quite famous for where we get rubber from. Again, very easy to maintain, easy to take care of, good to just stick in a corner and forget about. Has quite a nice strong structure to it as well. As well as the ficus, we've got yuccas. Now yuccas are native to Australia, and these ones are so easy to take care of because, as you can imagine, Australia is a very dry, sandy climate. They don't need much watering, they're great. This one, as you can see, has been cut off the top, rubbered over, and these shoots have been allowed to grow out the side. So therefore, in theory, we can take some of these off and start cuttings, but we might look at that at a later date. With the yucca, I'm going to put in the same category palms, just because very similarly, easy to take care of. Again, this one's not looking fantastic, but I have done that for a reason. These ones, again, you might find easy to just stick in a corner and forget about. Sometimes they're sold as outdoor plants. This one was sold as an outdoor plant, which means that it's going to be hardy to frost. So it can probably get to below -10 degrees before it starts suffering. But just as good to bring indoors, pop it in conservatories, windows and such like that. We're going to move on to slightly more tender on the foliage side of plants. So what that means is these are plants that don't deal so well with drying out, getting too cold. Generally they're more tropical plants that are used to humid environments and boggier climates depending on them. So I'll just run through a few of the classics and favourites of my own, and there's also a few that you might not have thought about before. So the first, very obvious one is the Boston fern. These are an absolute classic. They're easy to take care of, and they bush out to a massive sort of mess of fern leaves, and they're great fun. Again, you might see them at a lot of offices. On the fern side of things, I've got here a selection of a few different ferns. I'm not too sure on the exact names of them, but that's okay. What we're going to go through later on the care side of things is, as long as you know what kind of plant it is, I know these are ferns, I know that they need to be treated pretty much all in the same way. So I've got show you quick another little problemed plant just hiding underneath here. We're going to have a look at that one later and have a look at why it's curled up like that. But generally those are two lovely healthy looking ferns. They're enjoying themselves. So with that, we've got another one. Now this is a type that I had never seen before. I've heard of Alacosia and I've seen many different types, but I've never seen the Zebrina until recently, and that is just absolutely gorgeous stemmed. Looks very zebra-like, and these leaves are very strong structured, beautiful as they unfold and curl out. These do great in bathrooms. I'm going to go through why a lot of these plants do well in the bathroom. Another one that I recently discovered is called Maranta leuconia. Again, don't worry if you can't say the botanical names. The common names are just as good. It really doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it Steve if you like. This one's called the prayer plant. So as you can see at the moment, the leaves are folded out. Throughout the day, as the light dwindles, they're going to close up and they'll be facing like they're praying. It's a beautiful plant. You can watch it change and move throughout the day. So I put it in my bathroom so that as you're using the bathroom throughout the day, you can see it changing and it just breaks the day up a bit. Another plant that does quite a similar thing. Now, I discovered this in the rockery and alpine section of the garden centre that I work in. Fell in love with it, and I came across a video of somebody who kept it indoors, and I thought, That's brilliant. I'm glad you can keep it inside because it's such a beautiful plant. This one's called Oxalis. Now they've got these beautiful little butterfly type leaves. You can get this in a sort of a green, a natural greener colour. This one's another one I've let go down a little bit just because I want to show you guys exactly how to care for it. I've noticed that I put one outside and that one has some gorgeous little flowers on it and it's doing great. Everything's standing to attention. This one hasn't flowered so much, but that's not a problem for me because again, this one moves with the light. They'll open and close depending on the amount of light that they have. And they'll grow according to how much water you give them, pretty much. I've let this one dry out quite a bit and it seems still absolutely fine. Which is the great thing about alpine plants. If you ever look at the alpine section of a garden centre, these sort of plants need lots of light. That's one thing, it's lots and lots of light. But they can deal with cold, windy climates, they can deal with being dry, they can deal with some humidity, a bit of everything. So if you imagine being on the top of a mountain all year round, you're going to get all the extremes of weather. So these can deal with a bit of everything. So that's a few of my foliage. Oh, there's one more that I forgot about. Now, bromelias. These are fantastic creatures. I find a lot of people who come to the garden centre take one look at it and go, that's not real, that's a fake plant. I'm not going to buy a fake plant. It's absolutely real. This one's related directly to the pineapple plant. Just an ornamental flower at the top. It's nice and hard, crunchy flower there. Some of them you'll find are flat. They might be different colours. There's lots of different varieties. They all need to be treated pretty much the same. We'll go through all of that later. These ones can be a little bit temperamental and there's certain things that you have to do when they've finished flowering and it's all a bit awkward. So I just want to make sure that you're all aware of what these need so that if you're tempted to get one, you're aware of what's going to happen. Now, one thing to help you all, especially in these hot summer months, are carnivorous plants. Now, as much as these are fun, they can be quite handy because as the name suggests, they are plants that eat insects, for those of you that don't know. They do need very specific care, so again we're going to go through all of that, but I have found if you have an ant invasion, pop one of these close to where the ants are coming in a couple of weeks, even less, as well as your other natural methods of getting rid of ants. This one will help a lot. Once the ants have realised that they have a threat and that they're being eaten alive, they'll send a message back to the colony and they'll say, go back, go somewhere else. There's too much of a danger there. So that's another good one that we're going to go through in a little while. So now we've got familiar with some of these plants, let's have a look at their conditions that they thrive in best. Now, one of the most important things when it comes to plants is soil. Many people make big mistakes when it comes to putting the right plants in the wrong soil. So first of all, I want to talk about the types of soil that are out there. Now, the first and most important thing, especially nowadays, that you will notice on some bags of compost will be peat-free and multi-purpose compost. Now, peat is something that formed over thousands of years. It takes about, every year you'll get about millimetres worth of peat soil being created. It's really damaging for the environment for us to dig it up. Not only is it a fantastic resource for wildlife, it also releases a lot of CO2 when these peat bogs are dug up. Now, during the lockdown, it's been very difficult for a lot of companies to be able to supply all the variety of compost that they usually would. So sometimes we're just going to have to deal with what we can get. The only thing I'll say is if you're only able to get peat-based compost at the moment, whatever you do, do not use it for cacti and succulents. They just don't like it. There are a few cheats in using it, but I would just say don't use it for now. Try and get some cacti compost, or you're better off just planting them in sand mixed in with the compost they're already potted in. So unfortunately, on that subject, all I'm able to get when it comes to multi-purpose compost is peat-based compost. So we're going to have a quick look at that. Now, the first thing you'll notice about peat compost, I'm going to have a quick look in this jar. You can't see it fantastically well, but you get an idea that it's very dark. Now, dark soil is normally very high in nutrients. It's soil retaining. Let's have another look there. retains a lot of that moisture so that it's collected there in the soil and the plant can take it as and when it's needed. So there are a few plants that will deal well with this. Your ferns, your Boston ferns, and most ferns in particular will absolutely adore a peat-based compost. Same as your ivies, plants that generally might thrive outside in the UK, they do pretty well with this. Now, those are the sort of plants you don't want them to dry out too much, especially ferns. They like to sit in quite boggy, moist conditions. Now, peat being from bogs, it's the perfect ideal conditions for them. It's unfortunate that we're using it, but hey ho, we can only deal with what we can get at the moment. So when I talk about soils, there's lots of different mixtures when it comes to soils. You might hear about sandy soils, loam soil, and such alike. So what we want to do is we want to mix in a few different things to make sure that it's got the right consistency and the right texture. Now, you don't want to be going out to your garden and using your the mud from outside. As you'll see, if I wet this soil and I clump it up in my hand, I'm just going to make this sort of like sausage texture. Now that shows that it clumps and it kind of congeals far too much. So if you imagine that those roots are going to try and get through that almost sausage shape, they're just not going to be able to make their way, and too much moisture retained for a lot of plants will cause those roots to rot. So this is a general soil test that a lot of people can do. I'll show you a soil test also here with houseplant compost, and I'll give you an idea of the difference in texture. As you can see, the houseplant compost crumbles up a lot more even when it's wetted, same as the outdoor compost. So, what would we mix into compost? Well, one of the first things is sand. So, we get horticultural sand, sharp sand, grit sand. I've got grit sand here. Now, grit sand is kind of more compact and a little bit lighter than your sharp sand. Sharp sand is more coarse, so it's going to create sort of gaps, and if you imagine quite a coarse piece, it's going to create air in the soil and sort of less compaction. So if you have a look at this, it looks like a general sort of sand. Now the reason it's horticultural sand is it'll just be cleaned and sterilised so that there's no chance of any diseases, pests or anything affecting the plants. It'll be cleaned with materials that are okay for plants to sit in. Now, I have heard of people using play sand or general any old sand they can get hold of, builder sand and such alike. If you're worried about your plants and you've got a plant that's very sensitive and maybe expensive or sentimental, just boil the sand first, just to make sure that everything is cleared off it, there's no pests in there, there's no diseases, and all the chemicals are boiled off. So you can just boil it up, let it go up to a boil, rinse it out, let it cool, dry it out, and then use that for your potting. We'll get to the quantities in a moment. I'm just going to go through a few different mediums for allowing drainage. So next up, now there's vermiculite and there's perlite. I personally only have perlite at the moment. I'm quite faithful to perlite. I find I will use it instead of vermiculite. A lot of the plants that I have are kind of okay. But we'll go through a little bit of the difference. So vermiculite for a start is soft and spongy, and it's a volcanic rock. It absorbs moisture for quite a long time. So for your foliage plants like your spider plants or your alocosias, your ferns and things like this, they will do well from vermiculite because that's going to keep that moisture there for as long as it can without rotting the roots again. So it's got aeration, it's got drainage, but it's also moisture retaining at the same time. I know it sounds a bit contradictory, but it works well. Perlite, as I've got here, it's lighter, it's white, it's again a volcanic sort of rock texture. This one's more hard and porous, so kind of quite solid. It almost feels like a rock salt in a way, but a bit more crunchier. There's more aeration with this, so it's porous to the point where it allows air to flow through. Now, not many people think about air when it comes to plants, but they actually do need air for oxygen. As I've said before, if roots are left sitting in boggy waters with a large number of plants, they're just going to rot, and that's going to kill everything straight away. So we'll talk about this later, but when it comes to caring for a plant, if you can care for the roots, that's the most important thing, as the roots determine the life of the plant. So perlite, as I say, more aeration. It dries out a lot quicker than vermiculite. So this is good for a little bit of moisture retention. So you've got this sort of nooks and crannies and gaps within each piece, which will hold the moisture, but it's not soaking up too much moisture. So it's great for cacti and succulents, where you'll have a mix of both sand, vermiculite, and your compost. And it'll allow water to just pass through. It'll hold on to a small amount of that water and allow the roots to take that up without sitting in too much of it. We'll have a look at the symbols on here. We'll just go through a quick run through of what these ones mean, and hopefully that will help you in the future when you have a look at your houseplant ones. So with this, as you can see, we've got a sun symbol and a half blacked out sun symbol. So this means it can go in a fully sunny position where the sun's going to be on it all day, or it can go in semi-shade. So that means as long as it gets at least 4 hours worth of light, it should be fine. This one says that it flowers, and the Roman numerals will indicate when it should flower, so from what month to what month. You'll have an arrow that'll give you the height and then the spread, generally in centimetres. So that's an indicator of how big it's going to get. This one's saying that you can feed it. It doesn't say with what, but generally if it just says you can feed it, that means it's a multi-purpose feed. And this one's to look out for, it's not edible. If you're going to buy citrus plants, make sure that you're getting ones that are edible or inedible, depending on what you want. There are citrus out there that are purely ornamental, and they'll have this little symbol on there saying you cannot use them. So finally, we're going to go through just some of the care instructions. So I'm going to go through 4 main, most important things. First one, watering. Now, cacti and succulents only really need watering during the growing period, so that's mid-spring till late summer. Now with these, you want to just allow enough water so that it starts spilling from the bottom. So if you take your cacti, you're going to be given enough water so it just starts dripping out the bottom. Make sure that you're not putting it into your pot without drainage too quickly. Let that water drip off, pop it back in, put it in a sunny position. Don't water it again until the soil has gone quite dry. You're better off letting soil dry out completely than letting it be moist all the time, especially with cacti and succulents. Now with foliage plants, such as your spider plant, your ficus, and many other plants, ones that are leafy in texture, you want these to, as I showed you earlier, just dry out enough so that when you put your finger in, you can feel ever so slight amount of moisture. There are a few exceptions to this, like the banana plant, the fern, but they will survive if they do dry out a little bit. But try and keep them moist at all times. Now, bromelias, orchids, and other air plants, these are quite an exception. So we've spoken about orchids before, we've spoken about them being air plants and how they grow on trees and living in humidity. Now here's a bromelia. This is a beautiful plant. They're related to pineapple. They are also air plants, even though these ones do not photosynthesize using their roots, and you will find them in garden centres more often than not using compost. Now this one, you want to make sure that you're using rainwater. Cannot use anything else. Make sure it's rainwater and fill up, as you can see, just in the middle so that it's got a little pool of water to feed from. You don't want to moisten too much of the roots because they can deal with just a humid sort of environment. Keep this one in the bathroom. Again, rainwater only. Now, feeding. Feeding you only want to do during the growing period. Now, it's up to you what you use for your plant food. A general multi-purpose plant food can deal with most plants. Cacti and succulent, I would recommend getting a cacti and succulent feed, but multi-purpose should do absolutely fine. Now for a lot of these foliage plants, again I will use tomerite or a tomato feed of some sort. These ones are high in nitrogen and potash. This helps that plant develop healthy looking leaves, and the nitrogen helps with new growth. So it's going to grow fast, it's going to grow strong, it's going to look healthy. Now I wouldn't use tomato feed for your cacti and succulent. They have different contents of what they need, and I would just avoid that at all costs. Orchids, bonsais and citrus are those that also need their own type of feed. You'll generally find orchid feeds will help the preservation of flowers, These are feeds that will keep in mind the fact that they are meant to be on the side of trees, so they aren't liquid feeds or with contents that you will find in soil. Now, bonsai feed, as you can imagine, a bonsai is a very small tree. Trees need a very specific type of food, and if you're restricting the roots, as you generally are with a bonsai, you want to make sure that they're getting the feed that they need. So you should find that your garden centres or online you can find bonsai feed quite easily, as well as bonsai compost. Citrus also are one that can be particular. Unfortunately, in the UK, it's very difficult to grow citrus in the outside areas, so we keep ours inside, whether that's conservatory, greenhouse, or in a nice, hot, sunny position. Now, citrus, if you have edible citrus, they do need quite particular feeds to get a decent yield off them. Sometimes it can take a couple of years till you're going to get anything good off of a citrus, especially if you've bought it young, or if you've grown from seed or a cutting. When it comes to repotting, so one of the main questions is, when do I repot? Generally, a lot of the time when you buy a plant from a garden centre or online or wherever it may be, you will find that they will need repotting pretty quickly. Now, they will keep them in the smallest pot possible because it's easier to transport. If it's, if they repot it in a nursery and then send it out, there's a lot of space taken up that they could be filling with other plants. A general way to check if your plant needs repotting is to have a look on the bottom and see if you can see any roots coming out, such as this little root here. I'm sorry, that's not in focus. There we go. So we've got a little root popping out the bottom. That's a good sign that it probably needs repotting. Now, the other way to check is to take it out of the pot, or if you can take it out of the pot. So I'll cover the top with my hand like that to make sure I don't spill too much of the compost. That one feels like there's lots of space. It seems as though probably do with a bit more growth in the roots before I do repot that. So as we can see in this container where I've got 3 plants, one of them doesn't look like it's doing fantastically, as we mentioned before. Now, this doesn't always mean that the plant is dying. There are many plants that will expel old leaves once new ones are growing, just so that the new leaf has got all of that energy concentrated on photosynthesizing and getting everything it needs for the plant. Now, as you can see here, I'm giving my secateurs a thorough clean, making sure there's no old residue on them. I'll give them a scrub, make sure there's no old mud or moisture from old plants. I'll dry them and I'll sanitize them as well. And I'll make sure that anything I've cut before, if there's any disease or pests on it, they're not going to transfer to my next plant. Try and do this as often as you can. As soon as you're cutting something else, try and give your secateurs or scissors, whatever you're using, good clean. Now, I've got this container here and I'm just going to go around, and if there's any leaves that have dried up so much that I can just pull them out, I'll do that by hand. And then I'll use the secateurs to cut off the leaves as close to the stem as possible. And it just gives the plant that aesthetic look of feeling fresher. It means that there's no energy going to those old leaves where they're dying anyway, and it can concentrate on creating new growth and flourishing. Now, if there are yellowing leaves like this, that's a good sign that it either needs feeding, or it needs more light, or it possibly might be in the wrong compost. Now, with this one, I'm assuming that it needs a good feed, so I'm going to get a general multi-purpose feed, and next time I water it, I'll use that. As well as getting rid of old leaves, you can get rid of old flowers. Now, the most important thing with the flowering plant, if it has multiple flowers on it, is as they die off, which they will, is to pluck that out. Now, that plant is doing everything it can to create a flower, and that flower to go into a seed. Now, as soon as it's done that, that flower's done its job. So if you take away that flower and stop it from going to seed, it's going to do everything it can to make another flower, possibly 2. The more you pick them off, the more you're going to get. And it's concentrating that energy into creating those beautiful flowers that we just know and love. So here in my living room, I've got a selection of flowering plants that just aren't flowering. They haven't been for a little while. I've got a couple of jasminoids. This one's a gardenia. I've got one of my geraniums down here, which isn't looking fantastic. I've got the Tradescantia that we just repotted. That's not showing any signs of flowering yet, so hopefully it'll do well here. And Calthea. This one was a reduced to clear one in the local garden centre, so I'm just in the process of saving it. First of all, we'll have a look at the gardenia. one is one that I've not grown before, and I'm struggling a little bit with this one. Did have buds on it when I first bought it, but for some reason they keep falling off, and I don't think it's getting enough light in my bedroom. So I'm going to pop it here, and I should get a full day's light all the time. So we've got some pretty crispy looking new growth and a little bit of buds that aren't looking good. Best thing to do is just chop all of that off completely. Anything that looks the slightest bit dead, brown, dry or diseased, if it's going mouldy, best thing to do is cut it all back. And if it's established enough in the pot, the roots should send off new shoots, or the shoots that you already have there should be hopefully be healthy enough to keep growing and save the plant. We've also got the Calthea. This being an African plant, they do like that full sun position. They like quite a lot of hot, dry climate, but this one, again, isn't looking fantastic. I kind of forgot about it a little bit. It's the thing with this windowsill. I put things here to get better and then I forget about them. And sometimes they go a bit past what I wanted. So again, let's get the secateurs, clip off any old leaves that I don't like the look of. Very small, curly leaf, just there. There's a few of them around, so that's given me confidence that if it's producing new leaves and new shoots, then it must be doing okay. Now this is one that I've left to go a bit barren. It was used, unfortunately, as a bit of a incense holder, so that's kind of dried things out. The smoke has probably dried out the plant as well. It has been put in the wrong compost also, quite a long time ago when I first got into gardening, so this is quite a dense compost. It's been left to dry out for months and months on end. It's had incense sticks put in it, so it's a bit stressed and a bit, as you can see, dangly. That's not what a Christmas cactus should look like. We're going to have a look at what we can do to do our best to try and save it. And hey presto. So like I say, I want to replace this compost because I'm just not confident that it's the right compost for this plant. So I'm just going to gently crumble it, give it a little bit of a squeeze, make sure I keep those roots nice and safe. Give it a shake. And there we go. That should be okay. Now I can see that a lot of this is clumpy, big lumps. That's just not good for cacti. They don't like lumpy compost. They like free-flowing compost. Now what I could do is add a little bit of houseplant or cactus compost, which is a very small amount of multi-purpose compost, into this and some sand, mix it all up and reuse it. I don't like this soil whatsoever, so I think I'm going to get brand new soil for this one. So I'll show you how to do a mixture. So for this one, I'm going to be using a little bit of houseplant compost. Now, a lot of people will say that's not the best thing to do, but the only things I have at the moment are peat compost and this houseplant one. Now, I spoke about peat earlier. It's definitely not the thing to use for cacti. So this is quite nice. It's got lots of drainage. It's got lots of fibre in there. It's got a little bit of sand. The main thing that we want for cacti, they are a desert-loving plant. It's a bit more sand. Now the Christmas cactus is an interesting one because you can grow it the same way you would all cacti. We can grow it as an air plant, an epiphyte. Technically that's what they are, but they'll do absolutely fine with good, well-drained compost. I'm going to mix that up. I like to mix my compost in an open plate so I can see there's enough sand in there. I should really do a sort of quantity mixture and make sure it's sort of 70 or 30%, but I do things by eye. When you're confident enough, it's okay. I'm going to put a bit of that at the bottom of my pot. There we go. Probably want to shake a little bit more of that off, because if we look, that's going to fill quite a lot of there. Crumble a bit more off. Give it a shake. Well, there's lots of lumps there. Anything lumpy, you want to make sure that's gone. A little bit of a squeeze. Try not to squeeze those roots too much. Really dry. Don't know what I was doing. This was a long time ago before I knew what I was doing. So excuse me, please. But at least we've all learned something from it. Pop that in there. keep it nice and loose. You don't want to press compost, otherwise it will compact too much. Give it a little bit of a shake, drop it. We'll do a little bit more on that side. You don't want the compost to fill right to the top of the rim of the pot, because when you go to water, it might just overflow. Now here we've got a little bit of a root showing, so I'm just going to try and push that in a little bit if possible. Push the thing down, cover that root. If the roots are exposed, they'll just die off. They won't be able to take up any water. It's just not good for the plant. There we go. That's how to save and repot something that's in the wrong soil.